All right. Well, I have 2 p.m. Eastern time on my computer, and we want to make sure that we have hopefully a few minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome all to today's Beyond the Sea webinar, From Being to Doing, Anti-Racism as Action at Work. My name is Kiri Burkhat, and I'm the Data and Evaluation Coordinator for the Network of the National Library of Medicine Southeastern Atlantic region. Before I pass things off to our presenter today, there are just a few administrative details I'd like to go over. First, if you need closed captioning for today's webinar, you should be able to enable that at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. It might depend on how big your screen is, but you might see a button that says live transcript, or you might have to click the more button on your menu, but you should be able to enable that. Since we do have a nice big group today, aside from our presenter, microphones will remain muted and cameras will remain off throughout the presentation. We do encourage questions in the chat box, and as you're sharing, please be sure to send to everyone so that myself, our presenter, and all of your colleagues can see your comments and your questions. I think we are going to hold questions for the end of the presentation today, just to make sure that we can sort of smoothly get through the presentation. But hang on to your questions, but if you have comments or experiences that you'd like to share with the other participants, please don't hesitate to share them in the chat throughout. At the end of today's session, we'll share a link that you can follow to complete an evaluation. And that evaluation will be the first step towards claiming 1 MLA CE credit for today. And today's session is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to the NNLM YouTube channel, hopefully within the next week or two. And when that's posted, you'll get an email from me with a link to the recording and a copy of the presentation slides from today. So now I am pleased to introduce today's speaker. Ione T. Damasco is a professor and director of information acquisition and organization at University of Dayton, where she provides leadership, guidance, and support for technical services work in the university libraries. She's also the chair of the University Library's Diversity and Inclusion Team, which serves as a resource around diversity, equity, and inclusion endeavors across all areas and for every unit of the libraries. Along with several faculty and staff from around campus, she is part of the Dialogue Zone Steering Committee, which is dedicated to programming and other initiatives around different forms of dialogue that take place in a new library space called the Dialogue Zone. Her most recent research has centered on race and diversity issues in librarianship and potential uses of intergroup dialogue as a form of experiential learning focused on social justice outcomes in libraries. So with that, Ione, welcome. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so let's see here. Make sure my slides advance. Okay, so hello everybody. Again, my name is Ione Damasco. My pronouns are she and her. I'm very happy to join you today in what I hope is a thought-provoking session that inspires you to take real action to transform your workplaces. I hope that today's session helps you critically examine your work environments to see where typical work practices may have unintentionally exclusive or racist outcomes, and then share some real strategies and actions you can take to undo those practices. So this title, From Being to Doing, I think some of us are familiar with the word ally, and a lot of people think of ally as an identity, but I like to think of ally as a verb. And so I like to think of anti-racism as not just something we claim as a value, but something that we're actually actively doing. So before we get started, just a few ground rules for today, some of which echo what has already been shared. First, I want to acknowledge that as we move through this session, there might be some concepts that make you feel uncomfortable. And the purpose of this session, it's not to make you feel like you're being judged for who you are or what experiences you have had, but to think critically about how we do our work. And we do the most growth and learning when we are facing some discomfort, because discomfort means we're being presented with new information that makes us question our previous assumptions. So I hope that we can push ourselves out of our comfort zones today and stay in our learning zones together as we move through this session. Also, please practice active listening. Be present in this space and try not to multitask while you're in this session. I know it's really easy during webinars to try to do lots of other stuff at the same time, but I ask that you stay engaged. Please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. And again, I encourage you to use the chat box to add your own observations or realizations as we move through the session, but please be respectful in your communication. You know, on Zoom, it's really hard to determine tone when we don't have nonverbal cues to help place our words in context. And then finally, we'll use the progressive stack method for asking me questions in the chat at the end of the session. So holding your questions until that point would be really helpful. At that point, if you identify as BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, or person of color, please put an asterisk at the beginning of your question in the chat, and I will answer those questions first. And the reason for this is that BIPOC perspectives are often marginalized and sidelined, and I would like to try to center those perspectives in this space today. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. Let's break down the concept of culture first, since that's really the heart of what we are exploring today. And so here are just a few definitions of culture that I find really helpful. Culture, it's made up of many elements, both internal and external, or implicit and explicit. And although the definitions of culture listed here vary slightly, I think taken together, they are useful because they point to the fact that culture can be used to distinguish groups from one another, not just through shared patterns of behavior, but also through shared interpretations of things like artifacts, symbols, and behaviors. So, for example, one cultural group might look at a specific country's flag in one way. They might see that flag as a symbol of patriotism or national pride. But another cultural group might look at the same flag as the symbol of oppression or the symbol of an enemy nation, something that inspires fear or anger rather than patriotism or pride. You can probably think of other examples of cultural artifacts or items that two cultural groups may view very differently from one another. The other thing that I like about these definitions of culture is the acknowledgement that culture is something we learn through socialization. We subconsciously accept these without question, and these traits are often passed down from one generation to the next. So some of you might be familiar with sociologist Edward Hall's model of culture. Essentially, Hall compared culture to an iceberg. When you see an iceberg floating in water, the part that is visible above the surface is far smaller than the part of the iceberg that is underwater. So if we think of culture as an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg represents external expressions of culture. And these outward elements include customs, dress, food, art, music, language, writings. These are the things that we generally learn explicitly. We're conscious of them. And that also means that they're easier to change. The rest of the iceberg under the water represents all of the implicit elements of culture, and these include things like values, thinking patterns, beliefs, attitudes, perceptions, unstated norms, etc. These elements of culture are unconsciously learned, and therefore they're much harder to change because we're not always aware of them. But even though that they're present and ubiquitous in our lives. So each of us is shaped by culture. Often we're part of multiple cultures, and how we think of our identities is framed within those different cultural contexts. We can also share elements of culture with others who might think of themselves as being part of a different cultural group from us. And then the other thing that I like about the iceberg model is, cultures impact and influence one another as well. And I like to think of that as like icebergs, passing one another. Sometimes they collide, sometimes they melt and blend together, create a new iceberg. So, culture itself is very complex. So the same iceberg model can be applied to organizations. Just like people, organizations also have culture. Organizations also have beliefs, values, attitudes, shared assumptions, traditions, norms, and other unwritten rules. These cultural ideas often do get expressed in explicit ways. So for example, an organization's policies, processes, stated shared values, if you have a strategic plan that's posted, the way your work is structured, organizational hierarchies or organizational structural charts that you'll see, stated goals, those are all explicit expressions of an organization's culture. We each bring to our organizations a sense of our own individual cultural identities, and we have to navigate the ways our identities reside within our organization's culture. And that can be challenging if there are things that don't align between the two. There are many scholars, activists, and educators who argue that an added layer to culture in the United States is the ubiquitous presence of white supremacy culture. And these scholars argue that white supremacy culture has deep socio-historical roots in the United States and permeates American society. What this means is that organizational culture is not immune to characteristics of white supremacy culture. And for that matter, we as individuals aren't immune either. So what is white supremacy culture? I think when we hear the phrase white supremacy, we imagine hate groups like the Klan or the Proud Boys, groups that have become much more prominent in the last few years and are unfortunately politically charged climate. Maybe we think of social media posts where people make statements about white nationalist pride, or use open insults that are race-based towards Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. But these really are just the tip of the iceberg. So here are a couple of definitions of white supremacy culture that do a really great job of explaining the breadth and depth of what white supremacy actually is in the United States. So I'm going to actually read directly from the slide here because I don't think I can say any better than what these two definitions have stated. So first, white supremacy culture is the series of characteristics that institutionalize whiteness and Westernness as both normal and superior to other ethnic, racial, and regional identities and customs. While people often don't view this theorization of white supremacy as violent, it can lead to systemic discrimination and physical violence. White supremacy culture is also the explicit to subtle ways that the norms, preferences, and fears of white European descended people overwhelmingly shape how we organize our work and institutions, see ourselves and others, interact with one another and with time, and make decisions. Now, this doesn't mean that any single person who identifies as white is solely responsible for shaping and perpetuating white supremacy culture. Like I said before, these cultural characteristics have deep sociohistorical roots that go back hundreds of years, well before any of us were born. But we have inherited the legacy of these ideas. And regardless of our own racial or ethnic identities, we have each internalized many of these characteristics. That doesn't make us bad people, it just means we are deeply impacted by the culture around us. So now that we've reviewed some definitions of white supremacy culture, I'm going to ask you to sort of reflect on these particular statements. The first is that white supremacy culture can be, and usually is, present in organizations that are led by both white people and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. This kind of culture is deeply ingrained in the fabric of US society. And like I've said, we've all internalized it to varying degrees, regardless of our individual racial identities. Anyone can uphold it if conscious action is not taken to resist it. A corollary to this is that white supremacy culture hurts both white people and people who are BIPOC. So as we review some specific characteristics of white supremacy culture, you will see how the practices and processes associated with each trait are harmful to people from any racial background. And finally, white supremacy culture upholds other forms of intersectional oppression. So the harmful traits of this culture also enables the oppression of people who hold identities that do not align with specific norms. So if you identify as a person of color or low income or a member of the LGBTQ+ community or disabled or many other categories of social identity, you might be more likely to experience oppression. So dismantling oppression around white supremacy culture also means dismantling oppression around these other identities as well. So we're going to now look specifically at some characteristics and norms of white supremacy culture that show up in organizations. The ones I have listed here are just a subset of longer lists that you can find in different resources, and I do provide a resources list at the end of the presentation that you can explore on your own. So as I go through each, I'll start off by asking you to think about how much these traits resonate with your current library workplace environment. Then I'll follow with some anti-racist action steps that can lead to more inclusion and equity. You can think of the ones that are listed here in bold as being a major characteristic of white supremacy culture, while the terms underneath the bold points are traits that are connected to or reinforce that major characteristic. So the bold ones here are perfectionism, progress is bigger or more, and right to comfort. One other thing I would like to point out, while the greatest responsibility for implementing liberating, inclusive, and anti-racist action steps lies with library leaders or those who might hold formal power at your institutions, each person also bears responsibility for them and for sustaining them throughout the library, regardless of position. I really believe resisting these characteristics results in a more inclusive workplace for people from all backgrounds, and we can each contribute to the work of inclusion through small individual actions. So let's start with perfectionism. As I read through these statements, for your own reflection, consider to what extent each statement seems representative of the current environment at your library. So right now in my library, we rarely show appreciation for each other's work. And when we do, it's usually directed at the same individuals or group of people who often get credit, even if there were others who collaborated on that project. It is pretty common for coworkers, peers, supervisors, etc., to point out how a person or that person's work is inadequate. Mistakes are seen as personal. Making a mistake is confused with being a mistake. We don't invest in reflection or identifying lessons learned that can improve our practices. While we can easily name what's wrong, we have trouble identifying, naming, and appreciating what's right. So think about those a little bit and see if any of those kind of resonate with your experiences at work. So while we might think that perfectionism is this idea that pushes us to do better work, as a norm, it's actually quite harmful. And what's really insidious about it is that people often internalize perfectionism where they overemphasize their own, quote, failures and are unable to recognize when they have done good work. This can create a lot of harm to a person's self-esteem, and that can contribute to overall low morale at your workplace. So these are some specific actions that you can take to counter perfectionism. First, it's really important that we acknowledge that our BIPOC employees are often held to a higher standard than our white employees, and that might be happening unconsciously due to implicit bias. If you're willing to acknowledge this, then we can take steps to mitigate bias and ensure we are evaluating people's work fairly. We can also take the time to show people that each of their efforts are appreciated, and we should stop stigmatizing mistakes. Human beings will always make mistakes, and rather than treat mistakes as the worst possible thing that can happen at work, reframe them as learning opportunities that can push us to challenge our underlying assumptions. People are not mistakes. When we provide feedback, we need to ensure that the feedback is constructive and provides people the opportunity to take ownership of their mistakes by giving them the chance to think creatively. Ask them to offer up suggestions for what could have been done differently. And on a personal level, stop being your own worst critic. Extend the same grace to yourself that you would extend to others, and accept that being overly self-critical can actually impede your ability to improve because you end up focusing on your faults instead of thinking about how to leverage your strengths. Another hallmark of white supremacy culture that you might see at your workplace is either or thinking or binary thinking. Does this reflect how your library approaches problem solving? Are there often only two options presented to address an issue? You might feel that there is no shared sense that things can be both and, that we can sometimes hold conflicting ideas in the same space. This connects to that concept of perfectionism, because if everything is characterized as just right or wrong, that leaves little space for learning from mistakes. It also means that we tend to oversimplify things, and in doing so, we contribute to a problematic sense of urgency. There's no time to be creative and consider alternative approaches to a problem or a project. Binary thinking can also be used as a weapon against those who want to consider an alternate path because it pushes people to choose between A or B, and it suppresses other options. So moving away from binary approaches means taking a systems approach to thinking and acknowledging complexity. Take the time to understand and examine context as well, and learn how to incorporate intersectionality into your analysis of any issue. People are never singular identities, and projects or problems that you're working to try to solve together rarely have single ways of getting to a resolution. Again, this means providing the space and time to do deeper analysis, to be creative and propose more than two ways of doing something and avoiding oversimplification. It also means being intentional about providing space for marginalized perspectives and ideas to be brought forth. Binary approaches often suppress the concerns of BIPOC, so taking an intersectional, contextual, and systems thinking approach to work means elevating their perspectives. And it's important to give people time, to consider and be creative, to think about all of the options. And I think we're so used to trying to rush to get to outcomes. So getting away from either or thinking really means you have to invest time as well. Another trait of white supremacy culture is worship of the written word. And this translates to a few things. First, and I think this is very true of libraries, there's a pervasive belief that if something wasn't documented in writing, then it never really existed. So information that's shared verbally, decisions that were made in conversation, if it's not written down, those can be easily ignored or dismissed. This overemphasis on what's written down means it can be easy to manipulate or gaslight people if what people communicate in other ways is not given the same weight. This also means that alternate forms of communication and information sharing are not valued. For example, in some cultures, storytelling is a highly valued and respected way of passing along information, but storytelling, it's not something we often think of with organizational culture. This also means that we tend to value people with strong writing skills, but we don't necessarily value people who have strong relational skills because those are not as easy to document. We also tend to privilege standard American English, I'm putting those in quotes, so those who speak or write in any other way are seen as wrong or less intelligent. And finally, while written policies may exist, they may be applied unevenly to employees depending upon their racial identity. Again, connecting back to the idea of implicit bias. So for an example, consider if this has happened at your library or your workplace. A white employee violates a policy, is given a verbal warning, but an employee of color violates the same policy and a written reprimand is placed in their personnel record. So countering worship of the written word, it doesn't mean abandoning the process of documentation, but it does mean taking the time to determine what really needs to be written down and what can be communicated in other ways. It means being open to exploring, valuing, and validating different ways of sharing information. If you do write things down, avoid jargon or elitist language. And we all know that libraries are often very guilty of using jargon, acronyms, etc. One of the most important things to be aware of is that language involves culture, power, lived experience, geography. These all shape how we use language, and many of us have been socialized to have a bias toward unaccented standard English. If we reflect and recognize that bias within ourselves, then we have to consciously work against that and actively listen for meaning to people who use English differently from that form. And then finally, when you're thinking about your policies, think of them or treat them as living documents. What this means is that your employees should be able to question or challenge policies, and that those policies will be revised as needed to ensure equity. It's a good idea to do policy audits every few years to ensure the language and impacts of those policies are still inclusive and equitable. I think one of the narratives that we find in libraries right now, especially due to the pandemic, is a resilience narrative. One that says in libraries, one of our strengths is our ability to do more with less. Resilience is certainly a companion to this particular white supremacy culture idea that progress equals bigger or more in terms of what we do or what we produce. This idea is definitely rooted in capitalism, and we can see how bigger and more plays out in profit-driven environments. But that mindset has crept into library environments over the years as we have adopted business and corporate models into our workplaces. We make the mistake of thinking we have made progress if we have expanded, particularly in terms of our projects or services, but do we think about whether or not those projects or services are really what our communities want and need? Do we also think about the impact on our employees if we create new services or expand existing ones? Or do we just expect that our employees have the grit to make things work, even if they don't have enough resources? We really need to reframe how we think about progress. Bigger is not always better. If you're not familiar with the phrase seventh generation thinking, what this means is that we spend a lot of time considering the impact of our actions on those 7 generations from now, not just those at the end of our next planning cycle. So this gets us to really think about sustainability, to evaluate our resources realistically, to consider not just the community around us, but the people in our workplaces who will do this work. What are the impacts on morale, but also on equity, if we don't consult with all of our stakeholders when we make decisions? Do we place the same value on planning for how we do our work as much as the products of that work? And this one is a call to the leaders out there who are on the call today. Normalize being an advocate for more resources when your people need them. But even more importantly, normalize not doing something if there aren't enough resources to do it. I'm going to pause for a moment and take a sip of water. Pardon me. Okay. So next, we'll take a look at a sense of urgency. Does this phrase resonate with you in terms of the climate at your job? A sense of urgency that creates a highly stressed environment that creates barriers to being inclusive. Time is not given to allow for multiple perspectives to be considered, to encourage thoughtfulness, to think about long-term impacts and consequences, to engage in a truly democratic decision-making process. Again, connected to what we've talked about with progress, the focus is on deliverables, not the process of building capacity, community, or sustainability, nor is time given to consider what more equitable outcomes might exist. This can result in sacrificing the opportunity to create real allyship among different groups of people in the name of producing quick wins. But do we ask, who are those wins for? We also risk implicit bias playing a more pronounced role in decision-making if we make rushed decisions, which often happens when we overpromise what we can do or provide. So to counter that permeating sense of urgency, priorities and timelines for projects should be set for sustainability and equity. We should be giving people the space to address issues as they come up in the moment. Do we set timelines that account for the unexpected? I recommend making it a regular practice to build an additional 20% beyond what you think the project timeline should be to give space and time for process and for those things that come up that you weren't expecting or anticipating. Not doing so means you are effectively cutting people's ability to contribute meaningfully. And when we feel like we have to make decisions in a short amount of time, that often translates in practice to the same people dominating decision-making because space isn't made for other perspectives. And in many workplaces, that means people of color are often left out. Another hallmark of white supremacy culture is the value placed on quantity over quality. So again, connected to a sense of urgency, the value we place on quantity overlooks the importance of looking at our processes. We value quantitative metrics, but don't think about the value of those things that cannot be measured so easily. What about the stories behind the numbers? In libraries, that might mean we measure things like circulation statistics or door counts that provide raw numbers. But do we consider asking questions like who comes through our doors? Is who comes through our doors connected to how welcome they feel in our spaces? In terms of our work, do we think about measuring how well we manage conflict or how we ensure democratic processes are part of our regular decision-making? There's also this lack of understanding that when there's conflict between content and process will prevail. And what I mean by that is that if conflict arises over content, so let's say the topic of a meeting agenda, there's conflict around that topic, and attention isn't being paid to people's need to be heard, which is a process issue, any decisions that will be made at that meeting will ultimately be undermined or disregarded. And this is exacerbated by our discomfort with emotions or feelings arising as part of the decision-making process. In white supremacy culture, taking a quote logical approach is often privileged over decisions that are made that take people's feelings and emotions into account. So to move away from these oppressive actions, the focus of planning or projects should be on sustainability. As mentioned before, any cost-benefit analysis should include all costs, including human costs. Planning should include goals around process, not just outcomes. So for example, a process goal could be around how does your organization create feedback or communication loops around an initiative to be more inclusive? Look for ways beyond the quantitative to measure those goals. And be flexible. There might be times when you have to move away from a strict agenda to address underlying concerns that people might have. And if you've built in that extra 20% that I mentioned before with countering a sense of urgency, then you have the time and space to address those issues that you didn't account for originally. Overworking as an unstated norm is another characteristic that I think is very prevalent in libraries, and especially again during the pandemic. This again goes back to the resilience mentality in libraries that constantly asks us to do more with less. And in order to accomplish the excessive number of tasks we are assigned, we might find ourselves working when we are not at work. This can manifest in a number of ways. How often do you check email outside of your work hours? Do you work during your lunch breaks? Do you not even take breaks or put in extra hours outside of your normal work schedule without telling anybody? This often happens because work plans are created without realistic timelines or appropriate levels of resources. This can also manifest as asking and assuming your employees who are BIPOC to undertake the diversity work of your organization and not asking your white employees to do that same diversity work. I think one of the harder things for us to do is to resist overworking because it's so deeply ingrained in American work culture. Work with others at your library to foster a climate where self-care and community care is the norm, where everyone's mental, emotional, psychological, and physical well-being are valued and prioritized. Respect time boundaries so that others can do the things in their personal lives that are just as important as work, such as caregiving responsibilities or tending to personal health issues. Build extra time and flexibility into work plans to allow for the unexpected. I know that's something I keep saying, but I think it's really important. If you're in a position of power, if you're a formal leader at your institution, you have a responsibility to model a healthy work-life balance for your employees. Here's a small example, don't send emails that require actions outside of work hours. Even if you tell your employees you don't expect them to respond, if you send an email that requires their attention after their scheduled hours, it's very easy for them to put pressure on themselves to do that extra work. And then finally, recognize that projects or initiatives that have a specific focus on diversity should also be assigned to white employees, not just your employees of color. Employees of colors should not be expected to take on that work in addition to their normal job responsibilities. And if they do take those on, reallocate their workload so others can help take on some of their regular responsibilities, or compensate them extra for that additional diversity work. I think a lot of people don't realize that there is an additional emotional labor that employees of color take on when they are tasked with diversity work, in quotes, and that labor should be accounted for. So the right to comfort is connected directly to issues around silencing certain perspectives because those perspectives may challenge the status quo and by extension feel threatening to those who hold power. This trait of white supremacy culture is an attempt to preserve the emotional and psychological comfort of those with power, but in ways that you might not expect. For example, do we label those who challenge the status quo or question decisions as troublemakers? Do we think of them as rude or insubordinate, even if they present their concerns in a respectful way? And are the people most often labeled troublemakers employees who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color? Do we create false equivalencies that conflate individual acts of unfairness against white people with systemic racism that has historically targeted BIPOC library workers and others on a daily basis? We can dismantle this practice by learning how to embrace discomfort. As I mentioned earlier, discomfort is often an opportunity for learning and for growth. Deepening our understanding of systemic racism and oppression may make us uncomfortable at first, but doing so can help us understand how our own personal feelings and experiences fit into these larger systems. This can also enable us to identify new ways to resist those systems and work in solidarity with others to implement anti-racist actions at work. Letting go of this feeling like we are entitled to comfort also means that we accept that we should not take everything so personally and that we are willing to put in the work of developing our skills around dialogue so that we can participate in challenging conversations. I think in libraries, because we have this perception that many librarians are introverts, or that we're typically situated in quieter spaces, or that we are less assertive, that there is a climate of fear of open conflict. We try to avoid disagreement. When someone does raise an issue, our response is to to interrogate that person, call that person's credibility into question, rather than focus on interrogating the problem itself. And again, connected to the idea of our right to comfort, we use politeness to deny people the right to be their authentic selves. This is especially true for BIPOC library workers. So for example, if a BIPOC employee experiences a racist act at work, there's an unspoken expectation that they will mute their emotional reactions to that experience in the name of civility. We might also stigmatize those who have the courage to raise difficult issues and label them as impolite, rude, or out of line. We cannot use the excuse of being introverts or of wanting to maintain the guise of professionalism to avoid engaging in conflict. If we don't learn how to engage in open conflict in ways that are challenging and productive, we will never grow as people or as organizations. So it might be very helpful to use exercise like role-playing conflict, so you are ready to handle conflict when it really happens. And you might reach out to your HR departments to see if they can help you with those kinds of exercises. Another thing that is really important here is to be honest with ourselves and make clear distinctions between when someone is really being disrespectful and when someone is just bringing up a challenging issue. It's important to develop our listening skills, to not speak over each other, to really give each other the space to be authentic and candid without fear of reprisal. And when you do resolve a conflict, be willing to revisit it later to see if there are other ways that it could have been handled. So the last hallmark of white supremacy culture that I want to discuss today, that I also think is one of the most important, is an unwillingness to discuss race in our organizations. Even with more recent national attention being paid to anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism, there's often still a great deal of reluctance for people to openly discuss race in their workplaces. People will change the subject or just avoid raising race issues altogether. This demonstrates a limited understanding of how racial and cultural biases show up in every part of our lives, both professionally and personally. Often people frame difference as something bad, or they make statements like, "I don't see race, I just see people," which completely erases the lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. An avoidance of race discussions is often connected to two assumptions or perceptions. First, that if we talk about biases, we are automatically attacking white people. And the second is the assumption that white people cannot handle having conversations on race. These assumptions and lack of awareness feed into this behavior of avoidance. But failing to talk about race means we are missing crucial information and critical perspectives when we are making decisions or analyzing an issue. So ending the silence around race conversations means a lot of individual and collective action. Are we willing to be compassionately curious and question how race, bias, and culture might be impacting the issues or projects we are tackling? Can we acknowledge when our own or others' unconscious biases might be showing up? And do we give ourselves the space to pause, reflect on those biases, and then take action against them? Going back to some of the other practices I mentioned, we need to foster an environment where making mistakes is seen as a learning opportunity and not as a failure. If people are willing to engage in challenging conversations around race, they need to feel like they won't be demonized if they make a mistake during those conversations. Avoid binary thinking again around these issues, and don't try to set someone up for a gotcha moment where we're setting up someone to make a mistake and then paint them as a bad person or as a racist. We all have bias. We all engage in racist actions and anti-racist actions, and those can change from moment to moment. This is not a static thing. We are constantly learning, adapting, and navigating complex race and other identity issues. Self-care is really important. We need to develop our stamina for these discussions and ensure time for self-reflection. And finally, shaming others around race is counterproductive. We really should focus our energies on consciousness building and racist behaviors and not shame. Shame is a barrier to change, to learning and growth, and that's not where we want to spend our time and energy. So as you think about the ways in which these traits of white supremacy culture show up in your workplace, I want to challenge you to center the narratives and experiences of your coworkers, library users, collaborators, external stakeholders, etc., who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. If you are white, resist the urge to recenter your own experiences and feelings when you are developing and implementing anti-racist strategies, And as an organization, regularly revisit these questions in particular to ensure you are continuously engaging in anti-racist practices. So strive to be a learning organization. And these are some questions that you can take with you to think about. And we have a little more time than I thought, so we can talk about these too. So first, how can we distribute power differently in the organization so that it is shared more diffusely across the organization? How can we be open to learning on the job, making mistakes, and trying new things? How can we have a climate or culture that makes it easy for people to learn and change? How can we make sure we value and understand the importance of the informal interactions and conversations that are part of our organization? How can we help ourselves learn to talk about very complex issues, especially where we have very little shared experience? How can we make visible and value different forms of knowledge within our organization? And most importantly, how can we make time to reflect on our ways of doing and thinking? So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see the chat box better. And this is a good time if people have questions. Like I said, we'll use the progressive stack method. So if you identify as BIPOC, please put an asterisk before your question, and I will try to respond to those first. Otherwise, we can open it up to the group.
Ione, is it easier for you to field questions on your own, or would you like me to read them to you as they come in?
It might be easier if you read them to me as they come in.
Sure. Well, I only see one right now, so I suppose we can start there. Leslie asks, would you consider HR policies that require written documentation to pursue formal review of someone's actions or words as a product of our systemic white supremacy culture? And I think she asked this during the worship of the written word section.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, actually. I do think to some extent that that is a product of our systemic white supremacy culture. Written documentation, again, we're not these formal processes that are in place that don't allow for other ways of communicating information effectively silence people, right? And so if you are unable because of the circumstance to be able to write down at the moment something happens, at the time something happens, everything that happens, and then not be able to bring that as proof that you've had these experiences, it's that much harder for you to raise these issues that are happening. If you're experiencing racist microaggressions at work, for example, often it's the challenges around, well, nobody else saw that person or heard that person say those things, so it's just one person's word against another. But how can we be more compassionate and find ways to incorporate taking somebody's experience and assuming that they're telling the truth first, instead of operating from this assumption that they're trying to undermine somebody? I think especially if it's a person of color raising an issue, this idea of credibility, I think sometimes comes up. And I do think that that is a product of white supremacist culture being just so prevalent in our country. Other questions?
All right, Brittany asks, in the right to comfort section, I think, you mentioned one method to help mitigate this is to do role-playing conversations to work through conflict. Do you recommend the role-play pairings be white BIPOC or the same race? I'm curious as to whether doing these role-playing conversations would add more emotional labor on the part of BIPOCs.
That is a really great question. So some of the experiences that I've had with facilitating dialogues, particularly around race conversations with people from different backgrounds, I do think in those circumstances, it might be best for people to be grouped into affinity groups. And so folks who identify as BIPOC might work together in one group, and then folks who identify as white work in another. They might be given the same scenarios, but they work with people from a shared identity background to try to work through those. I also do think it's important that you do work with somebody. If it's not HR, seek out people who are skilled facilitators around race conversations and conflict resolution. I think it can be it can put a lot of additional emotional labor on folks of color, if they're in a space with white people and you're trying to educate your colleagues around your experiences, during these scenarios that you might be role playing. So I do recommend splitting up into groups. And I think, after those groups have had some experience working through those scenarios on their own, that with a skilled facilitator present, there might be an opportunity for intergroup experiences, intergroup working through those scenarios, where you have folks from who identify as white working with people who identify as BIPOC to work together. But I wouldn't start with that. I do think that you run the risk of there being additional labor placed on the BIPOC folks in that space.
All right. They ask, do you have recommendations for BIPOC when emotional labor within their organization is overloading them?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'm going to make some assumptions because this is through chat. So I'm guessing you're alluding to if you're somebody who identifies as a BIPOC worker and your workplace is giving you a lot of additional work that also has emotional labor added to it and you're feeling overwhelmed. So this is one where I'm going to call on our white allies in the space to be mindful of your colleagues, your BIPOC colleagues, and make sure that you are there as support for your BIPOC colleagues. And if somebody reaches out to you and says, I'm really overworked right now, think about what you can do as an ally to help redistribute that work. If you're somebody who you might not have positional authority, but you might have social capital where you can go to people in charge and just raise generally the issue like, hey, it seems like some of these projects are being put on the same folks and they're getting overloaded. Advocate for that work to be redistributed. Or again, if resources really aren't there to do the work, if you're somebody in charge, don't do the work, or get the resources that you need, advocate for resources that you need. If you're somebody who identifies as BIPOC and you're feeling overwhelmed with that emotional labor and you don't have resources, within your workplace, I strongly encourage you reaching out to other BIPOC networks. There are a lot of spaces outside of individual libraries that are out there in the library community that are offering places to be support for folks who are from BIPOC backgrounds, like the We Here group. If any of you are familiar, they have multiple social media spaces where people can sort of share their experiences, find networks, and get support. There may be other resources out there as well. I'm going to put a plug in for a colleague of mine, Katrina Davis Kendrick. She's done a lot of research on low morale in workplaces, and most recently on low morale for BIPOC employees in academic libraries. And she now offers, on occasion, a workshop for folks on how to sort of recover from low morale experiences. So just some things to think about. Other questions?
Oh, could you share your colleague's name in the chat?
Sure. Let me type that in there real quick for you.
Yes, and we also have another endorsement for We Here. She says, I love We Here. It's a very supportive group of individuals.
And I'll put in the We Here URL. It's wehere.space is their official website, but they have, like I said, they've got social media groups as well too. Other questions?
So as we maybe wait for another question to roll in, I'll ask one. Can you talk a little bit more about the dialogue zone in your library and some of the successes or challenges of organizing that?
Sure. So I was fortunate to attend the University of Michigan's National Intergroup Dialogue Institute in the summer of 2016. They're kind of the forerunners of intergroup dialogue as a model for experiential learning. And what intergroup dialogue is, it's a way of getting people from different group identities to be in sustained experiences with each other, where you learn to understand another person's perspective. So at Michigan, they have like the actual classes that students take where it might be an intergroup dialogue around, we'll use religion, for example. And so they might have students who come from a Jewish background in an intergroup dialogue with students from a Muslim background, and they learn how to have challenging conversations around topics that might be topics that are typically focused around conflict between those two groups. And they learn to listen. They learn how to practice, active listening. And really the goal is to help people understand the dynamics of power, privilege, to see where their identities might be occupying different spaces in our culture, and how they can work together in allyship ultimately to sort of undo social problems that we have. They have lots of ones around race. So the dialogue zone at my institution, several of us from around campus, we went to that. We came back here and decided, it would be great if we could have a similar kind of program. So we don't have courses, but what we do have is a dedicated space, which has had to have been virtual, unfortunately, for this past year, where we have facilitators who are trained in managing those complex conversations. And we have dialogues around, different topics. There's one coming up on the anti-Asian violence that's been happening. I'm helping people sort of process, and get a better understanding of what's happening against Asian Americans in this country around the pandemic and racism that's directed at them inappropriately because of COVID. So lots of topics like that. The biggest challenge really has just been there's a lot of demand, and we have only so many people who can facilitate at a time. So we've only been able to offer limited numbers of programs, but we're hoping to expand our facilitator board and train some students too, so that they can facilitate conversations with their peers.
Thank you. Leah asks, my organization receives a lot of grants. I see white supremacy culture upheld in my organization as our staff works to respond to the deliverables and parameters required by our funders. How do we begin to shift as an organization to develop work plans and produce work that aligns with us being an anti-racist, anti-biased organization when our funders and external organizations we work with may not be as far along in their journey?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's one thing to try to work on changing the culture at your own institution. It's much harder to try to have that impact on institutions that, you're not technically a part of, where it'd be harder to impact that culture. I think, again, so the worship of the written word, I think when you're submitting grant proposals, you really document that you need how that extra time, that flexibility is important, how that extra time and that flexibility can actually contribute to you producing better deliverables, better products at the end of your grant, because you're being more inclusive, because you're making sure that all options are being explored, and because in the end what you produce can end up serving more people, and that might be more appealing for your funders and external organizations if they think about reach. So that would be one response. That's a really tough one, though. Again, these are big systems we're talking about and big organizations. And I'll be honest, when money is involved, that's one of the hardest things. I think money is one of the things that really upholds white supremacy culture in our country. Money makes a lot of decisions for us, and those two things can be really bound up together.
Thank you. Sherry asks, I've been tasked with getting my company affinity group up and running. Any advice?
That's a great question. So at my institution, in the last year and a half, 2 years, several brand new faculty staff affinity groups have been formed. And it was there was a bit of a push from our Office for Diversity and Inclusion to do so, to try to get affinity groups formed, because I think there's a lot of data that shows workplaces that have affinity groups have better retention rates for employees of color. But I think you have to, I would say, starting organically, I don't think you can just force people who have a shared racial or ethnic identity to come together and all of a sudden be an effective affinity group. I think it's important to survey folks first to see what are their expectations, what are they looking for? Do they want it to be more of a social sort of group where it's just a way for people from similar backgrounds to get together, talk about family stuff, activities outside of work? Or is it a professional development thing? Is that the focus for the affinity group, where you provide professional networking, training? Is it a group that's going to have some advocacy responsibilities? Is this a group that will have the sort of the ear of, somebody in charge and can help advocate for resources for that particular group that may have not been addressed in the past? So I would start by surveying folks who identify as the particular identity that you're trying to form around that affinity group to see what areas of focus they want to see, and then build from there.
Thank you. I'm going to scroll up to Kristen's question. She says, our diversity, equity, and inclusion is led by white librarians. How do we ensure that we meet the needs of our BIPOC coworkers without asking for lots of emotional labor from them?
So that's a good question. I will say that I think, honestly, there's so much out there on the internet, on social media, and the research and the literature that's out there, that I think there are ways of hearing what BIPOC people are looking for, what we need, what we want, what we're expecting, what we're hoping for, what we're dreaming about, that you don't necessarily have to tap specific individuals for their personal input all the time. That being said, I think if you have created a workplace where people feel like they can trust one another, where people feel like they are respected and their points of view, they're not tokenized, their points of view are taken seriously and not just around DEI initiatives, then it's much easier just to have normal, regular conversations with your colleagues of color where these things just may surface. So I would say work on the climate and create a climate that's conducive to open, honest conversation, rather than doing something like sending out surveys or something like that, asking your colleagues of color, for ideas for what your DEI initiative should be. And also, again, there's a lot of information out there already in library land that you can find about what people are looking for.
Thank you. And we have one more question from Peter. He says, absolutely fantastic presentation, and expresses his appreciation for the new resources and information that you shared. He says, I still surprise myself discovering ingrained thinking and how it affects my perspective and behavior. Do you have recommendations about the sort of where do we even start with this, on our own versus together, like with our colleagues? So I guess to close, what would be your first step recommendations for exploring this further and applying this to our workplaces?
So I think one of the things I would recommend is, if you haven't taken the Harvard implicit bias test, seek that out to just examine your own, like get a good sense of like, where do your own biases lie? You might be surprised by what comes up. So having that self-awareness is really important. And then, the slides will be shared. I start with some references and resources that I think are really good ones to start off with for your own self-exploration. And those will definitely, we love citations. If you start with those cite many other things, you will go down a rabbit hole of lots of resources that you can use to educate yourself. And maybe, especially if you're somebody who identifies as white, start a reading and discussion group around some of those articles with other white colleagues, and have some discussions and strategies around how you can implement anti-racist action at your work. And then start to build coalition with other people, other identities, to see how you can work together to do this work. But the resources list hopefully will give you a good starting place. And I'm going to share my screen again to have that closing slide, so you can have the code that you need for your continuing education credits. There you go.
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Ione, for sharing your insight and your expertise on this important topic. I had been introduced to the white supremacy culture principles before, but it has been so helpful today to see them sort of contextualized to our work environments, and turned into sort of actionable steps that we can take. And thank you all for attending today's presentation as well. So just a few quick reminders before you leave. Today's presentation was recorded and it will be posted on the NNLM YouTube page as soon as possible. We try to do it within a week. Once the recording is available on YouTube, I will email everyone who pre-registered for today's webinar with a link to the recording and a PDF of the presentation slides. So I saw there was a comment in the chat asking to see one of the slides again. You will get them from me, so you can review them on your own. To evaluate today's webinar and to receive your MLA CE credit, you can visit the link that is on the slide, and I'm gonna find my chat box again and copy and paste it into there. And once you've completed this NNLM evaluation, you'll receive instructions on how to claim the MLA CE credit through the MedLib Ed website. So it's 3 o'clock. Thank you all for attending today's webinar, and a huge thank you once again to Ione for being here and for presenting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed my time with everybody today, and you asked some really great questions. Got my gears spinning in my head. Thank you so much.
So I see a comment from Ellen that there might be a problem with the link. I will double check that and email everyone once we finish today. Thank you all. Thank you, Ione.